Earth was coming out of the Ice Age 10,000 years ago and loading the first form of the world we know today. Oceans were still moving along the coasts, and the last mammoths were stuck on Arctic islands that were getting smaller. All over the world, forests were moving into old tundra. The Sahara was full of green lakes, and small groups of people were trying out ideas that would one day lead to farms and towns. It was rough, unsteady, beautiful, and strange. Today is the Greenlandian Age, the time when people stopped living the past and began making the present. The day the ice let go. Try waking up in a world where winter has been normal for a very long time. The rules change after a few human lives. For most of the last ice age, giant ice sheets sat on North America and Northern Europe like frozen shields. In some places, they were thicker than the tallest skyscrapers today. Generations were born and died under grey skies, with the horizon often ending in a wall of ice. People didn't think of it as the Ice Age. It was just the world. But inside that ice, a countdown was already running. Tiny changes in Earth's orbit and tilt were slowly tweaking how much sunlight hit different parts of the planet. Those changes are gentle on paper, but over centuries they begin to add up. Summers in the north got a little stronger. Winters became slightly less brutal. More snow melted than fell. At first, nothing looked different to the human eye. A hunting camp here, a glacier front there. But on the scale of the whole planet, a quiet tipping point was approaching. When it finally came, the shift was brutal. In Greenland's ice cores, scientists can see temperature jumps of several degrees within just a few decades. That's not climate change over deep time. That's your grandparents remember a different world. As the air warmed, the ice sheets woke up. They stopped being frozen statues and started behaving like slow, heavy rivers. Meltwater carved channels across their surfaces, pooling in bright blue lakes that sometimes drained in a single, violent rush. Crevasses widened. Whole sections began to slide faster toward the sea, groaning as they moved. For anyone living near the ice front, the landscape itself was suddenly unstable. Valleys that had been locked under ice for longer than human memory began appearing again, scraped clean and raw. Boulders that had been frozen in place were dumped randomly as the ice retreated. Rivers changed course. Dust storms kicked up from bare, freshly exposed ground. The soundscape changed too. Instead of only the howl of wind and the crunch of snow, people would have heard thuds, cracks, and distant roars as ice cliffs carved into the ocean. Imagine standing miles away and still feeling the faint vibration of a glacier collapsing into the sea. Downstream, all that melting had consequences. Rivers swelled with icy runoff, carrying silt that turned them cloudy and pale. Floodplains got wider and wetter. Low-lying areas that had once been dry steppe became muddy marshes in a human lifetime. Some hunting routes that had been safe for generations suddenly included dangerous river crossings or unstable banks. It wasn't even really solid ground. As the huge weight of the ice began to lift, the rock below began to spring back. The ground slowly rose up in places like Scandinavia and Canada, like a mattress getting firm again after someone steps off of it. For the people who lived there, the change would be small. Beaches and tide lines would slowly sink over hundreds of years. But it was another sign that the old world was losing its hold. And yet, for all this chaos, the big picture was simple. Cold, harsh stability was giving way to something warmer and more dynamic. Plants that could never survive near the ice front began to move in. First mosses and hardy grasses, then shrubs, then pioneering trees. The old tundra skin of the planet started to peel back, replaced by forests, wetlands, and richer soils. For humans, this was both a threat and an opportunity. Long familiar hunting grounds could vanish as herds shifted and ice roads became rivers. But new valleys and fresh plains opened up, full of animals that had never been hunted before, and plants that extended the growing and foraging season. The map in people's heads had to be constantly updated. From space, if you could see a time lapse of this time, You would see the white caps on the continents getting smaller, the shoreline changing shape, and green paint spreading north like it was there. It didn't feel like time passed for the people on the ground. It was like living on a moving target, because each generation got to receive a world that was a little less frozen, a little less dependable, and a little more like the Earth we know today, that rewrote the map. Ice started to melt, but the water didn't just flow into rivers and seas like it should have. It set up an exit in many places. North America and Eurasia's huge ice sheets are like big dams that leak. Along the sides and fronts of them, meltwater built up into lakes that were stuck between the land and the ice. Some of these lakes were bigger than any freshwater lake on Earth today. Straits of ice or piles of rock and dirt left by the glaciers were all that held them in place. As long as those natural dams are held, the lakes look stable in the geological record. Then suddenly, everything changes. One small collapse, one crack widening at the ice margin, and billions of tons of water had a new path downhill. That is a megaflood. We see the scars clearly today. In parts of North America, you can fly over channeled scablands, huge dry channels with streamlined hills and giant potholes gouged into solid rock. These are not features carved by ordinary rivers over millions of years. They look like what they are, the fingerprint of catastrophic floods that roared through in days or weeks. Think about living near one of those old lakes when it's very quiet. It looks like the surface is quiet and maybe a bit higher than normal. The nearby ice cliff might be making moaning sounds as a few small chunks break off. After that, the wall breaks. First, a deep rumble. The water near the outlet dips, then surges forward. The crack in the ice widens, and suddenly the lake is no longer a lake. It is a moving wall. A torrent hundreds of meters deep blasts through the opening, picking up boulders like pebbles, ripping out soil, trees, and anything else in its path. Downstream, the world changes in minutes. Valleys that once held modest rivers are filled from bank to bank and well beyond. Water slams into hillsides and rebounds, spreading sideways like liquid shrapnel. Flood waves climb slopes that normal rivers could never reach. When the chaos finally dies down, the landscape is different. New channels, new cliffs, new bare rock exposed where everything else was stripped away. These floods didn't just happen once. As the ice retreated in pulses, lakes reformed in new positions, held by new temporary dams. Each failure meant another surge, another round of rapid carving and rearranging. In some regions, a whole cascade of lakes could drain one after the other, sending multiple flood waves rushing toward the sea over a few centuries. At the coasts, the story continued. When a megaflood hit the ocean, it didn't just vanish. The sudden injection of huge amounts of fresh water changed local sea level, messed with coastal currents, and disturbed marine ecosystems. Sediment poured out in underwater fans, burying old seafloor and building new layers. In bays and inlets, murky water would have churned for days as the flood's energy slowly bled away. For humans watching from safer distances, these events would have been unforgettable. Imagine trading routes cut off because a known valley was now a tangled mess of rock and new channels. Fishing spots ruined by sudden sediment. Old crossings gone, new hazards created. Myths and stories about the time the river tried to eat the land practically write themselves. On a global scale, megafloods also nudged the climate. When enough meltwater surged into the North Atlantic at once, it could briefly weaken or redirect major ocean currents that carry heat around the planet. That meant regional climates could flicker, cooler here, wetter there, as the oceans worked to rebalance themselves after each freshwater shock. But the most frightening thing about these floods is that it sits below the seas today. It carved out deep pathways and wide valleys as water rushed along low-lying fields on its way to the ocean. Over the next few hundred years, the sea level rose, flooding those slopes and floodplains. Whole areas that were shaped by floods were washed away by the water, leaving only hints on sonar maps and in the way the coasts are made today. Doggerland, Europe's real-life Atlantis. Europe would look strange if the North Sea could be drained like a pool. We're used to seeing rough, grey water between Britain and the Netherlands. But now we could see a huge area of land with lakes, marshes, rivers that wind around, and shallow slopes. 10,000 years ago, that missing land was real and dry. People probably talked about the rivers and woods in the same way that we talk about towns today. They walked and hunted across it. We call it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbank where fishing boats still work today. But back then, this wasn't some anonymous offshore bump. It was the centre of things. Instead of an island on the edge of Europe, Britain was just the high western part of a much larger plain. You could walk from what is now eastern England straight to what is now Denmark or the Netherlands, without ever seeing the sea. Picture that world from ground level. To the west, rolling lowlands lead toward the chalk hills of Britain. To the east, flatter, wetter country feeds into the rivers that eventually join the continent. Between them, Doggerland itself, a patchwork of open grasslands, scattered woodlands, wetlands, and winding streams. Herds of red deer and wild horses graze the higher, drier ground. In the marshes, wildfowl erupt into the air when humans approach. Otters and beavers work the smaller streams. For Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, this wasn't a mysterious lost land. It was prime real estate. The combination of rivers, shallow lakes, and coastlines meant fish, shellfish, birds, and bigger game all overlapped. Seasonal movements of animals would be predictable. Salmon runs, migrating geese, red deer following plant growth. Small bands of people could set up camp near key crossing points or on low rises with a good view, then follow those patterns year after year. And they left traces, not in writing, but in things heavy enough to survive drowning. As trawlers drag nets across the North Sea seafloor today, they sometimes pull up more than fish. They find antler harpoons, flint tools, and bones of land animals like aurochs and deer. Some of the bones bear cut marks from stone blades. Every artifact is a small reminder that this empty sea once had campfires and footprints. The end of Doggerland wasn't a single disaster movie moment. It was death by sea level. As the ice sheets to the north shrank and sent meltwater into the oceans, the global sea slowly rose, not centimetres a year like today, but still fast on human timescales. Each generation would see the coastline move a little further inland. Low-lying wetlands turned to tidal flats, then open water. Rivers became estuaries. A camp that had always been safely up from the shore might suddenly be flooded during big storms. There were probably smaller, sharper shocks layered on top. Storm surges would have bitten deep into already weakened coasts. Some scientists think a massive underwater landslide off Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami several thousand years after our 10,000-year mark that smashed into the North Sea shores. For anyone living in the remaining fragments of Doggerland by then, that wave would have been a nightmare. Walls of water racing across already shrinking land. But the signs were there a long time before the big showdown. 10,000 years ago, people who lived in Doggerland were already living in a world that was changing. As side trips around bogs and inlets grew, the paths between known hills got longer. Crossing points that used to be safe became dangerous. Some places that used to have lots of food for animals may now be salty or always flooded. So what did people do? The most likely answer is simple. They moved. Not overnight, not as a single fleeing crowd, but gradually, over generations. Families and bands shifted west and east, tracking the retreating edges of habitable land. Some ended up in what is now eastern England, others along the coasts of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Those later communities carried with them memories of a time when the sea was further out, and the plain between lands was wide and generous. Those memories wouldn't have been maps the way we think of them. They'd be stories of a river that no longer exists, of hunting grounds you only reach now in dreams, of ancestors who lived out there where the waves are. For modern scientists, sonar surveys and sediment cores reconstruct that lost geography. For the people who lived through it, the loss was personal. A favourite fishing spot is gone. The burial site is underwater. the world their grandparents described literally no longer exists. The Green Sahara. With hippos, when you hear the word Sahara, the typical picture probably comes to mind. Endless brown dunes, a hot sun, and mirages on the horizon. 10,000 years ago, that idea in your head would have been completely wrong. At that time, the biggest hot desert in the world was mostly wet, green. A lot going on. It wasn't as Mad Max as it was planet-sized savanna with bonus lakes. The key player was the monsoon. Because of slow shifts in Earth's orbit and tilt, summers in the northern hemisphere got extra sunlight. That warmed the land more strongly, and warm land pulls in moist air from the oceans. The West African monsoon, which now just clips the southern edge of the Sahara, surged much deeper into the continent. Instead of dying out over bare rock and sand, rain clouds pushed inland, year after year. Where there is rain, there is water. And where there is water, everything changes. Dry basins that are now gravel plains or sand seas filled up into mega lakes. Lake Chad was once Mega Chad, spreading over an area bigger than many modern countries. Other basins hosted chains of shallower lakes and marshes that expanded and shrank with the seasons. Between them, networks of rivers and streams stitched the landscape together. Think about being on a low hill in this green Sahara. There aren't any sands on the horizon. Instead, there's open farmland, acacia trees and water that sparkles. Archer and zebra groups move through the tall grass. Giraffes look around in the trees. Hippos grunt and splash in the shallow parts of the lakes, and crocodiles slide between reeds. Bugs fly over the water like dragonflies. Thunderheads are building up in the distance, which means it will rain more. For humans, this was an invitation. People who had once skirted the desert margins now moved into the interior, following rivers and lake shores. They set up seasonal camps along the water's edge, where they could fish, collect shellfish, hunt water birds, and go after the herds that came to drink. Stone tools adapted to this watery world, barbed points for fishing, grinding stones for processing plant foods gathered from lush surroundings. We can still see their lives scratched and painted on the rocks. In places like the Tassili Nadja and other Saharan massifs, rock art panels show scenes from a world that doesn't exist anymore. Boats on big lakes, people swimming, herds of cattle and wild animals in landscapes that look nothing like today's bare desert. There are even detailed hippos and crocodiles, drawn with the kind of familiarity that only comes from seeing them all the time. Over time, people didn't just visit the Green Sahara, they began to manage it. In some areas, evidence suggests early herding of cattle and goats, blending foraging with the first steps toward pastoral life. A group might move seasonally between high ground and lake shores, bringing their animals along, following fresh pasture and water, and quietly experimenting with what it meant to manage herds instead of only hunting. The atmosphere would have felt almost surreal to anyone from our modern Sahara. Instead of harsh, desiccating winds, many days would bring humid heat and afternoon storms. Nights could be alive with the sounds of frogs, insects, and dripping vegetation. Rather than being a barrier between North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, this region was a bridge, a living corridor of life, culture, and movement. But this world was not permanent. The same orbital cycles that had supercharged the monsoon kept turning. Over centuries, the summer sunlight peak shifted and the monsoon's reach began to shrink back southward. At first, the change would have been subtle. Slightly shorter rainy seasons, lakes not refilling quite as high, rivers running a bit lower by the end of the dry months. For people relying on those waters, the warning signs were real. Fish became harder to find in certain shallows. Some smaller ponds dried out for good. Grass that used to stay green into the dry season browned earlier. Migratory routes for both wild game and herded animals had to stretch farther to find reliable water. Groups that once considered a particular lake or river bend home realized they had to move more often. As the ages went by, the change sped up. Basins that used to be full of plants turned into uneven fields, then scrub, and finally, the first dunes. As the lakes dried up, salty flats were left behind. Streams split up into separate sections or disappeared completely. The rock art stopped showing people swimming and boats and started showing chariots and scenes with more sand. That part of North Africa that used to be green slowly turned into the hard desert we know today. The final mammoths on the edge of the world. It wasn't rare or unusual to see mammoths during most of the Ice Age. They were just there. Okay, they were just in the background on the huge steppes of Eurasia and North America, like cars are today. The herds moved through open grass and low bushes, calves running between the adults as their tusks swung. It was used to cut them out of ivory, paint them on cave walls, and build homes out of their bones. By 10,000 years ago, that familiar world was breaking. The climate had warmed. The old steppe grasslands were shrinking. The forest was pushing north and west. Wetlands spread into places that had once been dry and hard. The wide open spaces that mammoths loved were being carved up into patches of trees, bogs, and new rivers. On the continents, their numbers fell. Some herds collapsed completely. Others retreated into the last bits of open country, trying to hang on. At the same time, sea level was creeping up. Coastal plains flooded. Shallow shelves disappeared under rising water. In the Arctic, this rise had a strange side effect. Higher seas cut off pieces of land, turning peninsulas into islands. Some of those islands trapped mammoth groups that had been living there already, cut off from the mainland before they could fade away. Think of a small Arctic island, ringed by cliffs and rocky beaches. Inside, the land rises into low hills covered in moss, hardy grasses, and dwarf shrubs. In summer, the ground goes soggy from meltwater. In winter, the wind blows so hard that snow can't settle in some places, stripping the ground bare. On one of these islands, a few hundred mammoths might roam. Not thousands, maybe not even 1,000. Just enough to form scattered family groups that know every valley and ridge. They are smaller than their mainland ancestors. Over generations, limited food and tight space have shrunk their bodies. But they are still mammoths. Shaggy coats, curved tusks, trunk lifting to smell the air. Their world is quieter. There are no longer giant predators stalking them like in the old steppe. The biggest danger is winter itself. Thin ice, deep cold, sudden storms, and years when plants don't grow well. On good summers, calves play in muddy hollows, splashing water with their trunks. Adults rub against boulders to scratch shedding fur. They follow the same trails their ancestors walked, paths worn into the soil by centuries of heavy feet. Those same trails lead to regret when times are bad. A field that used to stay green all year could now dry out early. A lake that you know well could shrink down to a dirty pool. A lot more people die young. A small group of people is hurt more by each loss than a large group of people on the mainland. But the real enemy now isn't spears. It's math. Tiny populations are fragile. A few bad breeding years, a disease, a harsh sequence of winters, a small shift in vegetation. Any of these can push numbers below a point of no return. Once that happens, even if the climate steadies, there just aren't enough animals left to recover. We only know about these last mammoths because of what they left behind. Tusks and bones in island sediments. Isotopes in their remains that hint at diet changes and stress. Ancient DNA that shows low diversity, like a family tree collapsing in on itself. The first experiment, villages without cities. People have had different ideas about home for most of their lives up to this point. You knew your way around your favourite camps, slopes and fishing spots. But you didn't put a lot of stone and sweat into one spot, like people would later do when they built cities. Following the herds, the seasons or the water was still the main way that people lived in the world. Around 10,000 years ago, in the Greenlandian Age, that pattern started to glitch. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not in the full civilization sense people imagine. But in a few key regions, humans began trying something new, coming back to the same rich spots so often and staying so long that those places became more than just camps. Picture a river valley in what we now call the Fertile Crescent. Winters are mild, summers hot and dry, but seasonal rains and snowmelt upstream swell the river, flooding nearby flats. When the water retreats, it leaves behind a layer of fine, dark silt. On those flats, wild barley and wheat grow thick and golden without anyone planting a seed. For thousands of years, hunter-gatherers passed through, harvesting those wild stands, cutting seed heads with flint blades, grinding them on flat stones. Eventually, some groups realized something simple and powerful. If you come back to the same patch, harvest carefully and maybe scatter some of the grain, that patch will likely feed you again next year. First, it's a favoured seasonal camp, a place with good water, good stands of wild cereal, and games drawn to both. Over generations, the camp gets a bit more solid. Semi-permanent huts or pit houses appear. You fix a roof instead of making a new one every time. You stash heavy grinding stones you don't want to carry. You might even leave some stored food in pits or jars, hoping it will still be there when you return. At some of these sites, archaeologists see signs that temporary stops became long stays. Trash layers thicken, hearths multiply, animal bones pile up, the ground around the dwellings gets churned and compacted from constant traffic. These aren't yet cities with streets and walls, but they are definitely more than a camp you strike after a few weeks. When people know they're likely to see the same families again at the same place next year, relationships deepen. You remember who owes you meat, who shared grain, who you might want your children to marry. Stories, rituals, and decisions start to have a place attached to them, not just a group. Some of these early towns are located near resources that are especially rich, like spring-fed oases, marshes full of fish and reeds, or intersections where different hunting grounds meet. In those places, groups may also meet at the same time, making the site a kind of yearly hub. Around big fires, people share stories and songs and bring news from other valleys. They also trade stones, shells, and paints. In a few famous cases, communities built special structures, circular, stone-lined enclosures or raised platforms that don't look like normal houses. They're too big, too decorated, too impractical for daily chores. These are gathering spaces, ritual spaces, places where many people stand together and look inward instead of just at the surrounding land. Before, the center of life was wherever the food and water were. Now, in these experimental spots, the center is starting to become the place itself. Food draws you back, but so do graves, stories, shared memories of events that happened here and nowhere else. Waste piles grow, so do tensions. When several families share a small patch for months, you need stronger rules about who uses which hearth, who gets which portion of meat, where animals are kept, and how you resolve disputes. Leadership becomes less about who can run fastest after a deer and more about who can keep the peace, plan the next season, or lead rituals that bind people together. People cut more wood for fuel and building. They dig more storage pits. They trample paths between water, dwellings, and fields of wild or half-tended plants. Around the village, a halo of disturbed ground slowly forms. Fewer tall trees, more shrubs and grasses that cope with cutting and grazing. Game animals might get shy and retreat a bit further out, forcing hunters to travel farther from an increasingly fixed home base. No one has invented cities yet. No one is making street plans or thinking about homes with thousands of people living in them. But the reasoning that will lead there in the end is beginning to show. Stay longer. Come back more often. Shape the land around a central point that everyone can see. The balance is weak. If there is a bad run of harvests, disease, or violence, people may leave a spot and say that the trial was a failure, going back to living a fully nomadic life. The test works in some places though. Every time I go back, I remember more, which gives me another reason to come back and another reason to build a little more, clear a little more, and stay a little longer. People used fire to change the world long before they had bulldozers, chainsaws, and concrete. 10,000 years ago, simple skills were known by people on all continents where lightning could hit. Fire kept you warm, cooked your food, made your tools stronger, and kept wildlife away at night. But as the Greenlandian Age began, fire was slowly changing into more than just a way to stay alive. It was also becoming a way to shape whole areas. In a warming world, plants were moving fast. Forests spread into old tundra. Grasses colonized fresh soils left behind by retreating ice. Shrubs thickened in places that used to be open. If you were a hunter who relied on seeing your prey before it smelled you, that creeping undergrowth could be a problem. A controlled fire in the right season knocks back woody plants, clears dead grass, and returns nutrients to the soil as ash. The next rains wake up buried seeds. Within weeks or months, you get a flush of tender green growth, exactly the kind of young plants that draw in herbivores. For a group that lights the fire and then returns later, it's like setting a bookmark in the future. Come back here when the new grass is up. The animals will be waiting. Too dry, and the flames might jump into trees and run away from you, killing more than you wanted. Too wet, and the fire sputtered, leaving a smoky patch and not much else. In some regions, the best time was just after the main dry season, when there was still fuel, but the first hints of moisture returned to keep the fire low and patchy. Across grasslands in places like North America, burns created mosaics, blackened, recently burned patches next to older, taller grass. Herds moved differently through this patchwork, and predators, including humans, adjusted accordingly. A family group might deliberately burn a strip near a known travel corridor, knowing that next season the regrowth would turn it into a natural feeding station. In woodlands and forests, low-intensity burns kept undergrowth in check. That meant easier walking, better sight lines, and more space for certain food plants that liked light. Nuts, berries, and bulbs might all benefit from a landscape that didn't choke itself with shade. Over generations, people came to know which hillsides responded well to burning and which needed to be left alone. In drier regions, fire became a way to keep grasslands from turning completely into scrub or closed forest. Regular burns favoured fire-tolerant species and kept open areas open. For animals like deer, antelope, and some birds, that meant more habitat. For people, it meant more predictable hunting and gathering. On the other end of the spectrum, in wetter tropical zones, fire was a sharper tool. Cutting and burning small patches of forest opened gaps in the canopy, letting sunlight pour down. In those brief, sunlit windows, early cultivators could plant useful species, tubers, fruit trees, or experimental crops, in soils enriched by ash. Over time, these cycles of cutting, burning, planting, and moving on created a shifting mosaic of forest ages, shapes, and uses. Not every fire was meant to happen. Lightning strikes in climates that are warming up could set dry plants on fire, especially near the edges of woods that are just starting to grow. When people were around those natural fires, they would sometimes help them move along or steer them by adding sparks where they wanted holes, or quickly cutting lines where they wanted the flames to go out. To an animal, the smell of smoke meant danger. To a human who understood it, smoke meant opportunity, future grass, future game, future cleared space for camps or small plots. Over centuries, this pattern burning left fingerprints. Pollen records show shifts toward plants that tolerate or even depend on occasional fire. Charcoal fragments build up in lake and bog sediments, marking periods of more intense burning than climate alone can explain. Some landscapes that modern viewers assume are natural, open habitats may actually be the long-term product of repeated burns guided by human decisions. There were risks. Burn too large a patch, and the game might avoid the area until it fully recovered, leaving a temporary food gap. Misjudge the wind, and the fire could destroy useful stands of trees, scare off animals, or even threaten your own camp. Managing fire meant managing uncertainty, balancing short-term costs with long-term benefits. Even so, fire was the only tool that many Greenlandian groups had that could work on an ecosystem-wide level. With stone tools, you could do different things with your hands. Valleys could no longer be used the same way after a fire. Ghost rivers and drowned forests beneath the waves. These days, land is coloured and called on a map, while seas are just blue and empty. There was still land there 10,000 years ago that you now see as empty blue. As the Greenlandian Age began and sea level kept climbing, low coastal plains all over the world were slowly sacrificed to the ocean. Not in one big gulp, but in a drawn-out, stepwise invasion. Rivers that had once wandered across broad flats were pushed back, their mouths drowned. Forests that had taken centuries to grow found their roots soaking in salt water. A fishing trawler working its usual spot in the North Sea hauls up, not just fish, but a chunk of peat with twigs still embedded in it. A diver off the coast of England swims past a line of dark stumps standing upright in the sand, like a forest frozen mid-collapse. Sonar surveys trace winding grooves on the seafloor that look suspiciously like river channels, complete with tributaries. These are ghost rivers and woods that have been flooded, They are pieces of the landscapes that people and animals lived in right before the Ice Age ended. Imagine a large area along the coast at a mid-latitude. 10,000 years ago, this wasn't underwater. It's a long, flat and sometimes wet strip of land that goes from the hills in the middle of the country to the faraway shore. It is cut through by a big river that splits into several branches near the coast. Over many years, these branches have built up a delta of mud and sand. On higher ground, thickets of oak, pine or mixed forest grow. Alder and willow trees grow along the edges of small lakes when it rains a lot. They camp on levees, slightly raised strips along the riverbanks that stay dry in ordinary floods. They fish in quiet side channels, gather mussels and oysters from tidal flats at low tide, and hunt deer that slip between forest and open ground. Kids learn which paths stay passable in the rainy season, which patches of salt marsh hide birds' nests, which sandbars appear as the tide drops. More land is hit by storm waves than anyone remembers. The mouth of the river moves upstream, making old fishing spots more muddy. Early in the tide, a popular path to a shellfish bed is cut off. To adapt, people move their camps a little higher, make boats, and change the schedule. People from every age can tell a story. We used to walk out there. There used to be a group of trees that marked the edge of the world. Now, the roots of those trees are in salty water. When salty water gets into freshwater waterways, it stresses out animals and plants that aren't used to it. As the water moves along the shore, some trees die and fall over. Their roots are uncovered and then hidden by new sediment. As the sea advances, waves chew at the front of the delta while the river keeps dumping mud and sand. Channels shift position, sometimes slicing through old floodplains to find a shorter route to the rising sea. Where seawater wins, low-lying areas turn into estuaries, long flooded river valleys where tides slosh in and out twice a day. From above, this looks like river systems getting eaten by the ocean. From the ground, it feels like home getting narrower. Eventually, the last dry ridges lose. The sea covers them, first at the highest tides, then permanently. Forests that had held on at the last possible elevation drown in place. Saltwater floods their root zones and the trees die standing. Their trunks become perches for seabirds, their branches break, and over time, sediments bury the lower parts. In anoxic mud, some of that wood survives, turning into the submerged stumps divers find millennia later. On continental shelves off North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia, ancient drainage networks sit preserved like fingerprints under the waves. Side-scan sonar shows incised valleys and meandering channels that have no business existing on the modern seafloor, unless you remember that this sea used to be land. In some places, peat layers, compacted remains of old wetlands and forests, stretch for kilometres under shallow water. They tell of long, stable periods when plants grew, died, and stacked up on themselves before the encroaching sea finally shut the system down. For people living through it, there would have been no global sea level curve, no neat graph. There was just the constant, nagging sense that the water was winning. Burial sites, once comfortably inland, needed to be moved. Old stories about where the land ended had to be revised. Myths about gods, spirits, or monsters taking back the shore would have been an obvious way to explain what nobody could stop. But while the sea washed away land, it made new things. Rich, shallow marine areas. When rivers dried up, the areas they left behind were great for shellfish, fish nurseries, and seagrass beds. People who lived near these changing beaches learned new skills, like how to make better boats and use the tides to their advantage instead of against it. The ghost of the old environment still shaped the currents and the way fish moved after it was no longer visible. Monsoon supercharge, Asia under extreme rain. We now think of the monsoon as a yearly pulse. Hot land pulls in wet air from the ocean, clouds form, and it rains all the time for a few months. 10,000 years ago, that system was turned up a notch or two. Because of Earth's orbital position in that period, northern summers got extra solar energy. Asia's landmass, especially the big interior of China and the Indian subcontinent, heated stronger and faster each year. Hotter land means stronger suction on moist ocean air. The result? A monsoon that pushed deeper inland, lasted longer, and dropped more water than we're used to now. Think of yourself in a flat plain, in what will one day be northern India. You feel like you're covered in a blanket of heat before the rain. There is dust in the air, rivers are low, and plants are there to wait. The wind changes then. First come the clouds on the horizon, building into towers. Thunder rolls. The first fat drops hit the dry ground and burst into little explosions of dust and steam. Within hours, the rain goes from scattered to solid, sheets of water drumming on leaves, roofs, rock. Under a supercharged Greenlandian monsoon, this wasn't a rare drama. This was the rhythm of the year. Rivers like the ancient Ganges, Brahmaputra, Yangtze, and Yellow River swelled beyond anything their Ice Age ancestors ever carried. Snowmelt from mountains added to the flow, but now it was topped up by vast trains of rainstorms rolling in off warm seas. Floodplains expanded. What had been narrow ribbons of green in drier times widened into broad belts of wetlands, oxbow lakes, and swampy forests. Seasonal lakes in interior basins filled more reliably, linking up into networks of shallow water that lasted for months instead of weeks. Plants responded instantly. Grasses shot up tall. Wild rice in some lowlands found perfect conditions: warm, standing water with plenty of silt. In northern China, wild millets and other hardy cereals spread across slopes and terraces, thriving in the alternation between heavy rain and bright, hot breaks. For animals, this meant abundance and risk. Deer, wild cattle, and other grazers had rich pastures, but also more chances to get trapped in mud or swept away by floods. Predators learned to hunt the edges, where animals gathered on higher ground as the waters rose, or along receding shorelines as floods drained and left the weak stranded. In South Asia, early groups timed their movements around it. They might move towards rivers and coasts as the rains approached, fishing in newly swollen channels, setting traps where fish and crustaceans were forced through narrow points. Later, as levels dropped, they could gather stranded shellfish, dig for roots in freshly softened ground, and hunt animals concentrated along shrinking water sources. In East Asia, people tracked the rise and fall of wild cereal stands. Heavy monsoon years meant better harvests of wild grains on low-S plateaus and river terraces. Too much rain and fields could wash out or rot, forcing groups to adjust their strategies and locations. Settlements in this world weren't just about where there was water. They were about how that water behaved. A camp placed too low would flood out, its hearths buried in silt. Too high, and it was far from the rich, temporarily flooded soils where plants and animals concentrated. Some groups learned to read the rain like a clock over time. Some stars rising at dawn could mean that it was going to rain soon. Birds, bugs, and even the colour of smoke in the distance could give you clues about how strong the season is. Stories, traditions, and early attempts to guess what kind of year it would be were all based on these findings. The land itself kept a record too. Layers of fine silt in old lake beds show repeated strong wet seasons. Between them, thinner, coarser layers tell of drier pulses or storm-driven erosion. Together, they form a barcode of ancient climate swings, one that scientists are still decoding today. As it rained more in Asia, the thought of staying put for longer became more appealing. You could make plans based on the fact that you knew the river would rise and then go away, leaving behind rich, wet ground. That made the first attempts to plant and care for wild species more successful. You weren't just betting on rain happening by chance. You had a rhythm that you could count on. Of course, a system that is supercharged can also move hard. Floods and flooding could be very damaging in years when the monsoons are very strong. Years when the trend didn't hold could lead to shortages that put a lot of stress on people and animals. The Americas after the giants fell. During the Ice Age, there were a lot of big people in the Americas. Glyptodonts with tail clubs that cover their bodies, gomphotheres and mastodons that are very tall, saber-toothed cats, and dire wolves. Ground sloths that are as big as cars. By 10,000 years ago, almost all of them were gone. The big strange cast of the Pleistocene was gone, and the Greenlandian Age started with less noise. It could be because of quick changes in temperature, people hunting, or a mix of the two. In North America, as the last ice lobes pulled back, a new pattern settled in. Great belts of habitat ran north-south, tundra up near the melting ice, vast spruce and pine forest below that, and farther south, mixed woodlands and open grasslands. In these zones, the survivors stepped forward. Bison surged into the role of dominant grazer on the plains, as you've seen. White-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and pronghorn spread through different mixes of forest, shrub, and open ground. Black bears and grizzlies, wolves, coyotes, and pumas adjusted their hunting styles to this new menu. Think about going for a walk in what is now the northeastern United States through a forest that was once in Greenland. It's damp outside and the air smells like trash and glue. There are no mammoths breaking through the trees that you can see. A white-tailed deer runs off with a flash of its tail, and further into the woods, a black bear turns over a log to look for bugs. Up in what will become Canada and Alaska, the ice fringe world is changing just as fast. Caribou migrate across widening bands of tundra and shrub, chased by wolves and watched by people who plan their year around those movements. Former ice margins are now braided river valleys and fresh lakes, loaded with fish and birds each short, explosive summer. Farther south in the American West, new wetlands and lakes dot basins left drier during peak glaciation. Paleo-Indian hunters follow herds along valley floors and ridges, leaving behind concentrations of stone points at kill sites and campgrounds. The famous big fluted points we call Clovis and later styles like Folsom are part of this story. Tools built for mobile life in a world that still had large animals, just not the truly huge ones. In Central America, dense forests climb volcanic slopes, while coasts host mangroves, lagoons, and rich coral reefs. Jaguars, tapirs, peccaries, and monkeys occupy niches that go back much further than the Greenlandian Age, but the loss of the biggest grazers and browsers changes local plant communities in subtle ways. Which tree species dominate, how fast forests close in, how open river edges remain. This is where some of the strangest giants used to live. Towering ground sloths, massive native horses, armor-plated mega armadillos. By 10,000 years ago, they're gone too. The pampas and savannas now belong to deer, smaller camelids, rodents, and a different set of predators, pumas, foxes, and in some places, jaguars spreading farther south than they can today. Consider traversing up into the Andes. People are starting to explore higher land here as the glaciers melt back up the rivers. Camels that look like alpacas and llamas feed on the cold, tough grasses above the trees. Early stone tools and dwellings have been found at levels that would have been covered in ice not long ago. Early high mountain cultures are building their bases, but not with towns yet. Instead, they are building paths, camps, and knowledge. Across both continents, human life is deeply local, but linked by broad patterns. On coasts, people focus on fish, shellfish, seals, and seabirds, using boats, rafts, and careful knowledge of tides and currents. In river valleys, they combine fishing with hunting in floodplains, tracking seasonal floods the way others track herds. In forests, they weave together hunting with gathering fruits, nuts, roots, and medicinal plants, reading the understory like a living library. There are echoes of giants in the stories we don't get to hear. People didn't make up stories about killing live ground sloths or seeing mastodons tear tree branches off, because those events happened before stories could become legends. But the land still remembers them in more delicate ways. Plant groups are still changing and soils still have marks from different dung and walking patterns. But for the people who lived 10,000 years ago, this wasn't after the extinction, it was just the world. As long as the world had enough game, danger, ways to explore, and niches to test, it felt like it was full. People in Australia also saw the seas rise and the beaches disappear, but they learned about these changes in a unique way, through songlines, which were networks of stories and songs that helped people remember places long after the waves came in. Australia on fire, songlines to lands, now underwater. Australia was bigger at the end of the Ice Age, a lot bigger. Science names this huge landmass Sahara. At that time, the sea level was lower, and what are now Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea were all joined together. The Arafura Sea, Torres Strait, and Bass Strait, which are all shallow seas, were mostly dry. They were replaced by wide fields, lakes, and river systems. People used to walk on land that is now open water to hunt, gather, and tell stories about headlands that don't exist anymore. 10,000 years ago, that world was getting smaller. As the Greenlandian Age began, the last big waves of meltwater raised the seas around the world. Sahara's low lands were some of the first places to be destroyed. The land that was flooded didn't go away right away, but it went away quickly enough to matter. Along the southern edge, the channel that would become Bass Strait was full. A land road that used to connect mainland Australia to Tasmania slowly became swampy, then flooded, and finally impossible to use without boats. Rising water crept across the continental shelf to the north, cutting New Guinea off across what is now Torres Strait. This turned gentle hills into shallow seas. For coastal peoples, the change was visible and personal. Imagine a camp on a low rise above a bay in what is now northern Australia. Generations have used this spot. The elders remember when the fishing ground was farther out, when a sandbar appeared at low tide and birds nested there. Now the bar is gone, swallowed by waves that don't retreat as far. Mangroves creep inland. Graves dug well above the tide a century earlier are getting worryingly close to the water's edge. You can move camp higher. You can find new fishing spots along the changing shore, but each shift has a cost. Old places of memory are left behind, and new ones must be woven into your stories. Aboriginal Australians had been using fire for tens of thousands of years. In the Greenlandian Age, as in earlier times, fire stick farming shaped huge areas of the landscape. People lit careful, low-intensity burns in chosen patches of grassland, woodland, and savanna. These fires cleared undergrowth, encouraged certain food plants, and created fresh green picks that attracted kangaroos, wallabies, and other game. Walk through a burned patch a few weeks after good rain. Instead of black ash, you see bright new grass and shoots. Animals come here first. Further away, in an unburned country, the grass is older and tougher. By staggering burns in different areas and seasons, communities built mosaics of habitat. Some patches newly cleared, some mid-regrowth, some long unburned. Each offered different resources at different times. This wasn't random destruction, it was long-term land management. Cool, frequent burns reduced the buildup of fuel, making massive, uncontrollable wildfires less likely. Fire-tolerant trees and shrubs survived and sprouted from roots and lignotubers. Some plant species relied on fire to trigger germination or clear competitors. Over millennia, this partnership between people, fire, and plants helped create the open woodlands and grasslands that many animals, and later European observers, took for natural Australia. In the north, where monsoon rains hit hard, burning patterns matched seasonal rhythms. After the wet season, when plants had grown dense and fuel was moist enough to keep flames low, people burned strips to open up the country and guide future animal movements. In the arid interior, fire could be used to keep spinifex in check and maintain a patchwork of food-rich and shelter-rich zones across otherwise harsh terrain. While the visible land changed under fire and rising seas, another kind of map was being updated in real time: songlines. Songlines are networks of story, song, and ceremony that trace routes across the land. They connect waterholes, rock shelters, hills, and other features to ancestral beings and creation stories. But they are also practical. They encode directions, resources, and warnings. To follow a songline is to navigate, both spiritually and physically. As headlands drown and offshore sand ridges become reefs, the stories shift. Some segments of a song that once described walking along a beach now describe travelling out there, beyond the new shoreline, to places that can only be reached in memory or by boat. In some Aboriginal traditions, there are stories of lands that used to exist where the sea now lies, with name places that line up suspiciously well with ancient topography reconstructed by modern science. People kept track of underwater settings long after they were gone by recording changes in the coast into oral history. Even if the mouth of the river has moved uphill, a reef may still be known as the place where the river met the sea. The name of a valley might be in a deep waterway. Songlines connected the present and the past across the rising water in this way. Worlds within wetlands: Nile, Tigris, and Indus, before kings. Think of pyramids, ziggurats, and brick towns as soon as you hear the words Nile, Euphrates, or Indus. That wasn't there 10,000 years ago. There were no pharaohs, there are no baked brick streets, there are no carved family names, just rivers, floods, mud, and small groups of people learning how to live with water that moved on its own schedule. Start with the Nile. At the dawn of the Greenlandian Age, the Nile wasn't yet locked into the perfectly predictable flood pattern that later Egyptian farmers depended on, but the basic rhythm was there. Upstream rains and snowmelt swelled the river. Brown water spilled over its banks, spreading out into shallow sheets across the floodplain. When those waters pulled back, they left behind a thin layer of dark, fertile silt. To hunter-gatherers camped on higher ground, this was like the land resetting itself every year. Wild grasses, sedges, and other plants sprang up thick and fast on the new mud. Fish crowded into temporary pools. Waterbirds nested in reeds and grazed on the fresh growth. People timed their movements around this pulse. They might spend the highest flood weeks on little natural levees or sandy ridges, fishing with nets, traps, and simple hooks. As the water dropped, they shifted down into the fresh mud zones, gathering plants, catching stranded fish, hunting animals drawn to the new green. Their villages were still seasonal clusters of huts or brush shelters, easy to build, easy to leave. But some spots were good enough that groups came back year after year. You can imagine a favoured bend in the river, remembered across generations. Over in Mesopotamia, along the Tigris and Euphrates, the story rhymed, but the details shifted. Snowmelt from distant mountains and strong Greenlandian rains built powerful flows that fanned out into branching channels and wetlands as they hit the low plains. Instead of a single ribbon of green, there was a complex patchwork: river arms, backwaters, marshes, and dry islands in between. At high water, the landscape blurred. Channels merged, lakes expanded, and reed beds turned into watery mazes. At low water, paths opened, firm ground along old banks, exposed mudflats, and roots between patches of higher land, fish and shellfish in quiet backwaters, birds in the reeds, wild cattle and gazelle on drier patches, stands of wild barley and other grasses on slightly raised ground, where silt settled just right. Small groups moved through this tangle in boats and on foot, reading the water's mood. They knew which channels were safe in flood, which sandbars emerged first when levels dropped, and where to find drinkable water when some pools turned stagnant. Some communities started staying longer in particular sweet spots, natural islands with good views, access to multiple channels, and a mix of wet and dry resources. Early signs of something new can be seen there. Shelters that are built to last longer, heavy grinding stones that are left in place, and piles of trash that are building up. They weren't farming lands yet, like later farmers in Mesopotamia did, but they were already playing games with the flood. Pick wild barley in places where you know it will grow back strong. You could spread some grain around the camp. You could pull weeds from around the best plants without calling it weeding. Farther east, in what would become the Indus region, rivers feeding down from the Himalaya and surrounding ranges spread out across alluvial fans and plains. 10,000 years ago, this wasn't yet the world of planned streets and brick wells. It was a quieter, earlier phase. Rivers shifted laterally over time, dropping coarse sediments near the foothills and finer silts farther out. Seasonal floods created belts of fertile ground along their edges. People moved between river terraces, small lakes, and foothill zones, mixing hunting, gathering, and heavy use of aquatic resources. Fish, turtles, shellfish, and water birds were key. So were wild plant foods, fruits, tubers, and grasses that took advantage of moist soils after floods. Nobody has stone palaces yet, but the first mental map of good places is forming. Certain levees, certain back channels, certain flood basins that always seem to bounce back after a big year. Groups meet repeatedly at these nodes, swapping stories, tools, and maybe spouses. Someone from upstream brings a new stone type. Someone from downstream has a slightly different way to make a point or a net sinker. And all the while, floods keep leaving quiet marks on memories. One year, the water rose just a little and wiped out a camp. A year when it didn't work, and there was cracked mud where there should have been lush reeds. Even though these things don't get written down, they don't go away either. They lead to stories about angry ancestors, spirits of the river, and practices that must be done to call the water in the right way. It takes time for the river bottoms to become more than just places to eat. They become places with meaning. Next, we step into those marks: rock art, ritual sites, and the first climate memories humans tried to carve into the world. Rock art, ritual sites, and the first climate memories. We've been talking about how the land was changing so far. Now we'll talk about something just as important: how people tried to remember it. 10,000 years ago, there was no paper, cameras, or tools for checking the weather. Stone, colour, bone, ceremony, and memory were what they had instead. During the Greenlandian Age, as the ice melted and the shoreline moved forward, people all over the world did something very human. They made symbols out of the world as it was changing. Think of a rock cave that rises above a river valley. Outside, everything is moving. Every year, the woods grow bigger, the animals move their homes, and the flood levels rise a little more. The air inside is still and cooler. Red ochre is ground up on a stone by someone. Someone else cleans up a rough spot of rock. After that, the lines start. At first, it looks easy: a hand pattern, a line of dots, and animal tracks. They turn into full scenes over time, with people with bows and spears, rivers and trees, and strange, abstract forms that may show roots, seasons, or regions. Rock art from just before and during the Greenlandian Age can be found in some parts of Europe and Africa. It shows animals that were already becoming rare or moving to new areas. Drawing them wasn't just for fun. These were here was what it meant. We knew them. We went after them. They lived in our world. In the Sahara, the story of the Green Sahara is written on stone walls. You see swimmers, boats, hippos, cattle, and savanna animals in places that are now nothing but bare rock and sand. Those images are basically a climate diary, proof that people remembered a wetter time and wanted that memory to last longer than any single life. Then there are the symbols we still struggle to read. Spirals, grids, zigzags, and repeated motifs appear across far-flung regions. We can't always decode them, but they may record things that are harder to draw literally. The cycle of the moon, the path of the sun through the year, ideas like many, increasing, or flowing. Alongside this art, people started building spaces that were clearly more than simple shelters. In certain regions, especially the Fertile Crescent and nearby areas, they raised large circular or rectangular enclosures with stone pillars, animal carvings, and carefully prepared floors. These sites weren't placed where it was easiest to hunt or camp. They often sit on hills or ridges with wide views, places you go to gather, to see and be seen. Imagine a cold dawn there. Small groups arrive from different valleys, carrying food, tools, and news. Fires are lit within the stone circle. Drums, rattles, or chanting echo off the pillars. In those moments, information moves. Who died, who was born, where the herds travelled last season, how high the water rose this year. Ritual and memory blend into one. Instead of simply saying, the water reached this mark on the rock, people attach that fact to a story. When the river spirit was angriest, it climbed to here. Or, when the sun stood in that notch between the hills, the great flood came. Over time, those stories become tools. A child who grows up hearing that when certain stars line up, or when the moon rises a certain way, the river will swell, is being handed a survival manual disguised as myth. Ceremonies tied to the start of fishing seasons, planting times, or migrations lock the calendar into people's minds. Burial grounds add a second, more fundamental level to this system of memories. There are groups of graves in certain places, like on hills, above valleys, on terraces with views of rivers, or in and around those sacred enclosures. When people bury their dead there, those places become important parts of their identity and memories. That hill is ours if our ancestors are buried there. This valley is important if our dead are here. If people have to move later because of changes in the climate, they can still use the marked places as guides. That's where the land was drier, that's where the ice used to be. Before the sea came in, that's where we fished. Oceans in flux, currents, fish migrations, and new coasts. Back 10,000 years ago, the seas were just as active as the land. We just don't see most of what was going on because it happened under the water. Not only did melting huge ice sheets raise the sea level, but it also added fresh water to salty seas, which changed their flow, weight, and temperature. That meant that the great conveyor belt of warm surface water moving north, cooling, sinking, and then moving back south at depth was still getting back to normal after the deglaciation. The biggest meltwater waves and the craziest megafloods stopped happening as the Greenlandian Age began. This let the Atlantic circulation settle into a pattern that is more like it is today. But settled never meant still. Fresh water from the last stages of ice melt continued to spread across northern seas like a light lens on top of denser salty water, making it harder for deeper water to sink. Whenever that sinking slowed, the way heat moved through the system changed. Some regions cooled, others warmed, and storm tracks shifted into slightly different paths. Coastal people didn't know anything about density gradients or overturning circulation, but they lived with the knock-on effects every day. They felt it in where storms hit hardest, how often winter sea ice crept into bays, and which fish showed up in nets and when. Along the Atlantic coasts of what is now Europe, small coastal groups synced their lives to those shifting rhythms. They knew when herring-like fish usually pushed close to shore, when larger predators followed, when shellfish were at their fattest, and when storms normally shut down travel. A subtle change in currents that nudged the main schools a little north or south, or shifted their run by a few weeks, wasn't an abstract climate signal. It was a direct test of whether they could adjust routes, timing, and trading partners quickly enough. On the Pacific side, similar dramas played out with different cast members. In the North Pacific, looping currents we would recognize today were still being tuned by post-ice age tweaks, and salmon had to navigate this moving maze. By 10,000 years ago, salmon runs were already key events in many northern rivers. Fish that spent most of their lives at sea surged inland in massive pulses, carrying ocean nutrients deep into forests. Bears, wolves, birds, and humans all locked onto that calendar, stacking their own feeding and movement plans around it. If ocean conditions pushed salmon numbers up or down, or shifted which rivers got the strongest runs, the entire food web adjusted, including people, whether they were ready or not. A good year or a bad year started far out at sea. Closer to the equator, coral reefs were racing to keep pace with rising seas. As water flooded over former coastal plains, new shallow zones opened up, perfect for corals, seagrasses, and mangroves. Older reefs that had grown near the former shoreline suddenly found themselves in deeper water. If enough light still reached them, they kept building upward, and if not, they turned into drowned skeletons, while new reefs colonized nearer to the shifting coasts. From above, it would have looked like entire reef systems slowly relocating. For coastal communities, that meant fresh fishing grounds coming to life in places that had once been empty or too deep. Lagoons formed behind young reef barriers, while mangroves rooted in freshly flooded mudflats and created nurseries for fish and crustaceans. Seagrass beds spread across gentle slopes, feeding turtles, dugongs, and countless smaller species. People learned quickly where the new hotspots were. A bay that had been too deep and barren for their grandparents might now shelter a thriving reef. A former river mouth might have become a rich estuary loaded with oysters and shellfish. Simple dugouts and skin boats became like body extensions, making it easy and quick to move between these changing resource spots. It became important to be able to read small changes in currents, sandbars, and watercolor. Finding out about tides and swells was important for life. Knowing which point caused dangerous standing waves and which channel concealed a rock bar was key. Also, knowing when the tide would turn could mean the difference between getting home with fish and not at all. Every trip across a bay was also a small lesson in how the ocean works. These lessons built up over time into a mental map of the sea. In polar and subpolar seas, retreating ice opened new coasts to marine life. As sea ice pulled back, open water lingered longer each year, giving plankton more time to bloom and feeding growing populations of fish, seals, whales, and seabirds. Humans followed that moving edge. Along the North Atlantic and Arctic fringe, hunters learned to work these new boundaries by waiting at seal breathing holes, paddling along ice margins where whales and birds concentrated, and dragging boats over ice to launch them into narrow leads of open water. Their success depended on very fine-grained knowledge of how ice, currents, and wind interacted, built from watching the sea season after season. From above, the big picture looks like this. By the time the Greenlandian Age started, the seas had changed from the rough, post-glacial state to something more like how they are today. The currents became stable enough to make it easier to predict the weather in different areas. The rise in sea level slowed down compared to the earlier, faster waves. As the coasts and levels changed, marine ecosystems changed too. Over time, people learned to ride these new patterns instead of starting from scratch all the time. From where we are, it's easy to see this as the moment when Earth finally calmed down after the Ice Age. The Greenlandian warning, when stability becomes fragile. The Greenlandian Age is a very small part of Earth's past. It's only the beginning of the Holocene, which is only a few thousand years on a planet where time usually goes by hundreds of millions of years. But for us, it's everything. The world was still a mess 10,000 years ago, but things were finally getting better. Things were getting less crazy during the Ice Age. The ice sheets were getting smaller instead of bigger, and the sea level was still rising, but it was doing so more slowly. Ocean currents were getting back to normal, and the weather settled into a band that wasn't too hot or too cold for the first time in a very long time. Most importantly, it was pretty stable. There were still cold spells, dry spells, and natural tragedies, but the Greenlandian climate was like a long, deep breath after the wild changes of the deep Ice Age. People stepped right into it. The experiments you've just seen, fire-shaped landscapes, semi-permanent camps, floodplain villages without cities, early herding and plant tending, only make sense in a world where people can trust that next year will look roughly like this year. You don't gamble on planting seeds if you think the ice might suddenly come roaring back. You don't build stone gathering spaces if you expect your valley to be buried under a glacier again in your grandchildren's time. The Greenlandian Age is the start of a deal. Even if nobody knew it at the time, Earth offers a rare stretch of climate stability, and humans use that stability to build something new. As centuries roll on from our 10,000 year ago snapshot, that deal deepens. Those early experiments in the Fertile Crescent turn into real agriculture. Villages grow roots, surplus food appears, and populations rise. Along the Nile, Tigris-Euphrates, Indus, Yellow River, and beyond, small floodplain camps slowly become permanent farming communities. Fields replace patches of wild grass, and animals that once roamed free become herds with owners. In forests and grasslands, managed fire continues to carve out mosaics of habitat. Along coasts and islands, boats knit together wider networks of trade and sharing. Songlines, rock art, and ritual sites become the bones of cultures that carry memory forward long before writing exists. All of this rides on the back of a climate that, by Earth's usual standards, is almost unnaturally steady. Temperatures wobble up and down a bit, rain belts drift slightly, and glaciers advance and retreat in some mountain valleys. But there is no new global ice sheet, no sudden planet-wide heating spike, no complete rewrite of the rules like the one that ended the Ice Age. That long quiet is what eventually allows cities to appear. That same quiet is what lets empires imagine they can last forever. It's what lets a species specialize in building permanent things on a planet that is usually anything but permanent. Now jump in your mind from 10,000 years ago to right now, where modern humans look back at the Greenlandian starting point through ice cores, lake sediments, fossil pollen, and ancient shorelines. From those layers, we can see how temperatures, greenhouse gases, and sea levels shifted as the Holocene unfolded. We can also see something more unsettling. The Greenlandian Age marks the beginning of the only climate span we've ever known as normal. Everything we call history, from the first farms to the internet, fits inside that window. Which makes one fact hard to ignore. We've been acting as if this rare stability is a permanent feature. It isn't. The same slow forces that help melt the Ice Age ice sheets are still running in the background. Orbital cycles, solar variations, volcanic pulses, and tectonic shifts. And on top of that, we've added our own rapid push by pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere faster than almost any natural event in tens of thousands of years. When you put our most recent emissions on top of those long-term records for Greenland, the line stops looking smooth and starts to spike very high. 10,000 years ago, small groups of people watched as the coasts moved inland. They reacted by moving their camps, changing their ways and changing the stories they told. The long Holocene calm made it possible for billions of people to live in cities that don't move. These cities are built on beaches and floodplains. The simple message that the Greenlandian Age hides is that the world you think of as normal Earth is only one phase. The coastlines you draw as if they were set, the weather bands you think will stay put, and the seasons you count on were all gifts of a short, lucky steadiness. When the Earth came out of its last deep freeze, our ancestors saw ice melt, seas rise, woods march, animals go away, and whole countries like Doggerland go away. Every shoreline, every floodplain, and every fossil cliff is part of an unfinished process. If this journey changed the way you see the world we live in now, click like, share this with someone who loves deep time nerd stuff, and click subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next program. Click on the next movie when you're ready to keep going. It will take you to a new world that has disappeared.